Welcome to part 3, the final part of this training module on gender mainstreaming and biodiversity action in Thailand. In parts 1 and 2, we built the conceptual foundation and the international policy context. In this part, we bring it home. What does the evidence actually tell us about gender and biodiversity here in Thailand? This is the part of the training most directly connected to the work that you do every day. The findings here come from a systematic evidence review and from primary data collected with people across government agencies, NGOs, and communities working on biodiversity in Thailand. Just a quick recap. This is part 3, covering gender and biodiversity evidence from Thailand. If you've watched parts 1 and 2, you have the foundation you need for what follows. So, part 3, gender and biodiversity, evidence from Thailand. What the research and primary data tell us. Before we look at the findings, it's worth understanding how the evidence was gathered, because the methodology shapes what we can say with confidence. The evidence draws on 4 types of sources. First, a systematic literature and policy review, national policies, legal frameworks, government statistics, and international research relevant to biodiversity and gender in Thailand. Second, civil society documentation, reports and shadow reports from NGOs, women's organizations, and ethnic communities. These sources capture experiences that formal systems often don't. They're essential for understanding the gaps between what policy says and what communities experience. Third, stakeholder consultations, multi-agency workshops with ONEP and other government ministries and partner organizations, bringing together the people who implement biodiversity policy to identify gaps and priorities firsthand. And fourth, focus group discussions, targeted conversations with civil society to capture perspectives from the ground up rather than only from institutional actors. The result is a picture of gender and biodiversity in Thailand that is both evidence-based and grounded in real practice. The findings are organized across 4 thematic areas, which we will go through now. Before we get into the specific thematic findings, I want to highlight 3 patterns that emerge consistently across all 4 themes. These are not isolated observations. They're structural features of how gender currently operates in Thailand's biodiversity sector. The first is systemic underrepresentation in governance. Women's absence from biodiversity governance bodies, management committees, technical working groups, policy forums, is not accidental. It reflects structural barriers that require deliberate, sustained action to address. And it matters for outcomes. Decisions about biodiversity made without the full range of knowledge and experience available are less likely to work for everyone. The second pattern is persistent data gaps. Sex disaggregated data and gender responsive indicators are largely absent or inconsistently collected across biodiversity monitoring systems in Thailand and across the world. This is not a minor technical issue. Without data, we can't measure what's happening, identify where inequalities are most acute, or demonstrate progress over time. Data gaps make gender invisible in accountability systems. The third pattern is that gender integration is project dependent rather than institutionalized. Where gender is addressed, it tends to depend on specific external funding requirements or the initiative of an individual project, not on consistent institutional practice. This creates fragility. When the project ends or the funding changes, the gender work stops too. Keep these 3 patterns in mind as we look at the specific thematic findings. You'll see them appearing again and again. So the first theme covers ecosystems, land, tenure, and climate. Biodiversity loss disproportionately impacts women. As natural resources become scarcer, forests degraded, water sources depleted, agricultural yields reduced, the subsistence work that women disproportionately perform becomes harder and more time-consuming. Women walk further to collect firewood and water. The burden of coping with biodiversity loss falls unevenly, and it compounds the time poverty we discussed in part one. On land and forest tenure, Thai law formally asserts equal rights, but formal equality does not translate to equal outcomes. Women hold approximately 36% of land titles. Community forestry systems typically register households rather than individuals, which tends to default authority to the male household head. And women's customary tenure, the informal but real authority over land and resources that many women hold in practice, is rarely recognized in formal planning. Women's knowledge is central to forest management and traditional ecological knowledge in many Thai communities. But formal planning processes consistently prioritize formal rights over customary practice, which means women's knowledge is systematically undervalued and underutilized, even when it's essential to effective conservation. And on climate and environmental risk, women and men often perceive and manage environmental risks differently, based on their different relationships with ecosystems and their different roles in household and community life. But these differences are rarely incorporated into adaptation planning, which means strategies may be less effective than they could be. Moving to conservation, wildlife, and invasive species. When protected areas restrict access to forest resources, the impacts are not felt equally. Women who depend on those resources for subsistence, for gathering food, medicine, firewood, face more severe livelihood consequences than those whose livelihoods are primarily formal or market-based. And these impacts are rarely formally assessed in conservation planning. Women contribute significantly to conservation activities: restoration, seed collection, biodiversity monitoring, community patrolling, but they do so largely in informal roles without formal recognition, compensation, or institutional status. Their contribution is real, its recognition in formal systems is not. Field-based conservation work also carries specific safety risks for women. Risks of gender-based violence and sexual harassment and exploitation in remote settings. These risks are compounded by the fact that institutional safeguard policies in the biodiversity sector rarely address them explicitly. This is a gap that needs attention. On human-wildlife conflict, women bear significant livelihood and safety consequences when wildlife damages crops, threatens livestock, or endangers community members. Yet women remain largely absent from the decision-making processes that determine how conflict is managed. The people most affected have the least say. The third theme covers economy, livelihoods, and benefit sharing. Women are major actors in Thailand's biodiversity-based livelihoods, in agriculture, fisheries, and forest product sectors. But they systematically capture fewer economic benefits. They face gender gaps in access to assets, credit, and market linkages that limit their ability to benefit from the value they generate. Bio-based and green economy initiatives, part of Thailand's BCG economy agenda, risk reinforcing this pattern if they're not designed carefully. Without deliberate gender-responsive design, the benefits of these initiatives tend to concentrate among those who are already best positioned to access them. Women's groups and smallholder women need targeted entry point support to participate on equitable terms. Sustainability standards and certification schemes present a related challenge. While these can open doors to premium markets, they often impose compliance requirements, documentation, auditing, upfront investment, that are harder for smallholders with limited institutional access to meet. Women smallholders may bear a disproportionate share of these compliance burdens. And on traditional knowledge and benefit sharing, I want to spend a moment on this because it's a finding I think is particularly important. Women in Thailand are central holders and transmitters of traditional knowledge about plants, ecosystems, agricultural varieties, and medicinal resources. This knowledge is foundational to biodiversity conservation and to access and benefit sharing, or ABS, but formal ABS processes rarely name, recognize, or protect women's roles in this. The people who hold the knowledge most often don't have the formal standing to negotiate the terms of its use. The fourth and final theme is the most cross-cutting: governance, finance, data, and legal frameworks. Gender integration and cross-sector policy and planning in Thailand's biodiversity sector remains largely ad hoc. Where it does exist, it tends to be driven by specific external requirements, a donor condition, a project deliverable, rather than by a consistent institutional approach. This creates fragmentation, different agencies doing different things with no shared standard and no continuity when individual efforts end. On biodiversity finance, women face structural barriers to accessing finance in this sector: limited collateral, administrative complexity, and institutional biases in lending and grant allocation systems. A biodiversity finance strategy that doesn't account for these barriers will direct resources toward those already best positioned to access them. On data, as I mentioned when we discussed the three cross-cutting patterns, sex disaggregated data and gender responsive indicators are inconsistently collected across biodiversity monitoring systems. Women's and ethnic women's knowledge is insufficiently captured in formal knowledge systems. The data gap appears in almost every area of biodiversity governance we examined. And on legal frameworks, the integration of gender provisions into biodiversity and environmental law remains incomplete. Ethnic women, in particular, face compounded vulnerabilities, sitting at the intersection of gender, ethnicity, and often geographic marginalization, and encounter significant barriers to legal recourse when their rights are violated. These are the people who most need legal protection, and they are the least served by current frameworks. Before we close, I want to invite you to sit with a few questions. Looking back at the four thematic areas we've just covered, which finding feels most relevant to your own work? It might be the one that resonates most with what you've observed in your own experience, or the one that surprised you, or the one that challenges something you previously assumed. Where do you see this playing out in your own context? In the way consultations are designed, in who shows up to field assessments and who doesn't, in what gets measured in your monitoring data, in who benefits from the programs you're a part of. What type of gap does it point to? Being specific about this helps identify the right response. A participation gap calls for a different kind of action than a data gap, which is different again from a legal gap or a financing gap. And what does this suggest needs to change? Not necessarily at a grand systemic level, though systemic change matters too. But what does it suggest for how your institution works or for your own practice, starting right now? These questions are the bridge from this evidence to the action that follows from it. Thank you for completing all three parts of this training. You've now built a foundation across gender concepts, international policy, and the evidence base from Thailand. This training was developed under the Jeff 8 umbrella program in support of Thailand's NBSAP from 2023 to 2027, in collaboration with UNDP Thailand and ONEP. For questions or further information, please contact your training coordinator or those institutions. Thank you, and I hope this training has been useful for your work.